A chance encounter. The summer heat clung to the air like an invisible blanket, the kind that made everything feel heavier and slower. Inside the rusty Spoon Cafe, the steady hum of conversation mingled with the clinking of coffee cups and the soft whir of the espresso machine. Edward Foster stood behind the counter, his worn apron tied loosely around his waist. His hands moved automatically, wiping down the counter, refilling the pastry case. But his mind was somewhere else. Edward had lived in Maplewood his whole life, a town so small that one rumor could make its rounds before lunchtime. It was the kind of place where dreams often got buried under practicalities. Yet Edward held on to his, even as the weight of reality pressed down on him. His dream of becoming a full-time artist felt like a distant mirage. For now, he painted on weekends and worked at the cafe to pay his bills. The doorbell jingled, its familiar chime drawing Edward's attention. He glanced up, expecting to see another regular, a farmer in dusty overalls, or a high school kid grabbing a milkshake. But what he saw made him pause. The woman who walked in didn't belong to Maplewood, or at least she didn't look like she did. Her skin was a rich mahogany, glowing under the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. She wore a bold, flowing green dress that seemed to dance with every step she took, paired with a headscarf that framed her face like a crown. She wasn't thin like the women Edward was used to seeing in town, but her confidence made her radiant, commanding attention without saying a word. She paused near the entrance, scanning the room with a smile that seemed to light up every corner. The cafe's patrons turned to look, some subtly, others not so much. Maplewood wasn't used to new faces, especially ones as striking as hers. Edward noticed the whispers starting almost immediately, small-town murmurs of curiosity and judgment. She walked to the counter, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. Edward swallowed hard, feeling an unexplainable nervousness creep up his spine. "Hi," she said, her voice warm and melodious. "What do you recommend?" Edward blinked, momentarily thrown off by the directness of her gaze. Well," he stammered, glancing at the menu overhead as though he didn't have it memorized. "The caramel latte is popular. And if you're hungry, the peach cobbler is pretty amazing." Her smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth. "Peach cobbler, huh? Sounds like you're confident in your desserts." He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's my mom's recipe. She swears by it." "Then I'll take a slice. And a caramel latte," she said, sliding a crisp $10 bill across the counter. "I'm Bethany, by the way." "Edward," he replied, taking the bill and punching her order into the register. "You're not from around here, are you?" She laughed, a rich, hearty sound that seemed to fill the room. "That obvious, huh?" "No, I'm just passing through. I'm a baker, scouting towns for my next big adventure." "A baker?" Edward asked, intrigued. "What kind of adventure?" Bethany leaned slightly against the counter, her confidence unwavering. "I want to open a bakery, a place that feels like home for anyone who walks in. I've been traveling for weeks, trying to find the perfect town." Edward raised an eyebrow. Maplewood doesn't seem like the kind of place people move to for a big dream. She tilted her head, considering his words. "Maybe. But dreams aren't about convenience, are they? They're about chasing something you can't let go of, no matter how unlikely it seems." Her words hung in the air, resonating with something deep inside Edward. He handed her the latte and the cobbler, watching as she carried them to a small table by the window. The sunlight poured in, creating a natural spotlight that seemed to follow her. As she took her first bite of cobbler, her eyes lit up. "Oh, this is dangerous," she said, glancing back at Edward. "You weren't kidding about this cobbler." He chuckled, feeling an unexpected warmth in her compliment. "Told you, my mom's a genius." For the next hour, Bethany sat at her table, savoring her food and sipping her latte. Edward found himself sneaking glances at her between serving other customers. There was something magnetic about her, something that made the cafe feel brighter, as if she carried her own light. When she finally stood to leave, Edward felt a pang of disappointment. She approached the counter, her radiant smile still in place. "Thanks for the cobbler and the company," she said, sliding a generous tip into the jar. "I might have to come back tomorrow." Edward's heart skipped a beat. "You'd be welcome any time." She held his gaze for a moment longer before heading out the door, the bell jingling softly behind her. Edward watched as she disappeared down the street, feeling as though he had just witnessed something rare and extraordinary. That night, as Edward closed up the cafe, he couldn't stop thinking about Bethany. Her confidence, her laughter, the way she seemed to carry her dreams so boldly. It was all so different from the cautious, predictable lives most people lived in Maplewood. It made him question his own life, his own dreams. Maybe there was more out there for him than he had allowed himself to believe. Little did he know, Bethany's arrival was just the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives and the town of Maplewood forever. The spark of love. The sun dipped low over Maplewood, casting long shadows across the town square. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the warm evening air as Edward wiped down the cafe counter for the last time that day. The rusty spoon was empty now, the chatter and bustle of earlier hours replaced by a peaceful stillness. Yet his thoughts were anything but calm. Bethany. She had been on his mind ever since she first walked into the cafe. There was something about her, a quiet strength wrapped in warmth and confidence. She wasn't like anyone Edward had met in Maplewood, where predictability reigned supreme and life rarely strayed from the ordinary. As Edward flipped the cafe sign to closed, the doorbell jingled unexpectedly. His heart leaped, and there she was, Bethany, framed by the fading light of the evening sky. "You're cutting it close," Edward said with a smile. "I figured you wouldn't mind one last customer," Bethany teased, stepping inside. "Never," Edward assured her. "What can I get you?" "How about just company?" she said, her eyes softening. "If you're not too busy." Edward's pulse quickened. "Let me lock up, and I'll grab us a couple of drinks." Bethany nodded, taking a seat by the window as Edward secured the door. He brewed 2 cups of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. "So," Bethany said as he sat across from her, "you ever thought about leaving this town?" Edward let out a short laugh. "Only every day. But life has a way of keeping you tethered, you know. Bills to pay, responsibilities. Dreams get put on hold." Bethany took a sip of her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. "What would you do if nothing was holding you back?" "Paint," Edward said without hesitation. "Full time. I'd lose myself in it, create things people would actually care about. But art doesn't pay the bills. Not here, anyway." Bethany leaned forward, her expression intense. "Edward, life's too short to play it safe. You can either settle, or you can fight for what you want. I chose to fight, even when people told me I was crazy." Edward studied her, admiration flickering in his chest. "Is that why you're opening a bakery?" She nodded. "Baking is in my blood. My grandmother used to say that baking was like telling a story. Every recipe had a soul. I want to create a place where people can taste love and joy in every bite." "That's beautiful," Edward said sincerely. "But aren't you scared? What if it doesn't work out?" Bethany's smile didn't waver. "Failure's part of the journey, but I'd rather fail chasing my dreams than succeed living someone else's." Edward let her words sink in. There was a courage in Bethany that both intimidated and inspired him. She was bold in a way he had never dared to be. They talked until the sky turned a deep indigo, sharing stories of childhood, dreams, and fears. Bethany spoke of growing up in Atlanta, where her grandmother's kitchen was a sanctuary filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and sweet cakes. Edward shared memories of discovering his love for painting as a teenager, sneaking out to the fields to capture the golden hues of sunset on canvas. "You have a gift, Edward," Bethany said softly. "Don't hide it." His chest tightened. No one had ever believed in him like that, not even his own parents, who saw his art as little more than a frivolous hobby. As the night wore on, The atmosphere grew warmer, more intimate. The distance between them seemed to shrink, as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. "Bethany," Edward said hesitantly, "you're different from anyone I've ever met." She tilted her head, curiosity dancing in her eyes. "Different how?" "In a good way," he clarified. "You make me feel like maybe there's more out there for me than I thought." Bethany's gaze softened. "There is. You just have to believe it." Their connection felt electric, charged with unspoken possibilities. But Maplewood was a town that thrived on tradition and conformity, and Edward knew that people were already talking. Bethany was a bold, curvaceous black woman with big dreams, and he was a small-town artist barely scraping by. It was a combination that didn't fit into Maplewood's narrow expectations. Yet in that moment, Edward didn't care. The cafe was dark except for the soft glow of the pendant lights above them. The world outside faded away, leaving just the two of them. "I should probably get going," Bethany said reluctantly, glancing at the time. Edward felt a pang of disappointment. "Will I see you tomorrow?" She smiled. "Maybe." As she stood to leave, Edward walked her to the door. The cool night air greeted them as they stepped outside. "Thanks for tonight," Bethany said, her voice gentle. "You're good company, Edward." "So are you," he said, his voice sincere. There was a brief pause, the kind that teetered on the edge of something more. Edward wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Bethany seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached out, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Good night, Edward." "Good night, Bethany," he managed, watching as she walked down the quiet street, her silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. As Edward locked up the cafe and headed home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was on the brink of something extraordinary. Bethany had stirred something in him, a desire to break free from the confines of his small-town existence and chase the dreams he had buried for far too long. But change was never easy, and Maplewood wasn't a town that welcomed it. What Edward didn't know was that Bethany's arrival was just the beginning. Their story was far from over, and the path ahead would be filled with challenges, surprises, and a love that would defy expectations. Whispers in a small town. The Rusty Spoon Cafe buzzed with its usual morning crowd, the aroma of coffee and freshly baked muffins hanging in the air. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden patterns across the worn wooden floors. Edward stood behind the counter, hands steady as he prepared a line of orders. Yet his mind was anything but calm. Bethany. It had been a week since their late-night conversation, and she had returned to the cafe every day without fail. They talked about everything and nothing. Art, baking, dreams, and fears. Edward found himself counting down the hours until she walked through the door, her radiant presence lifting the weight of his routine. But not everyone shared his admiration for Bethany. Maplewood was a town that thrived on tradition, where change was met with suspicion and gossip was a sport. The regulars at the cafe had taken notice of Bethany's daily visits and her growing connection with Edward. Whispers spread like wildfire, tinged with judgment and disbelief. "Did you hear about Edward?" Mrs. Whittaker, the town's unofficial gossip queen, said in a hushed tone to her friend at the corner table. "I did," her friend replied, leaning in conspiratorially. "That woman, Bethany, is it? She's not from around here. And she's, well, you know." Mrs. Whittaker's lips pursed. "Exactly. Doesn't fit in, if you ask me." Edward pretended not to hear, but their words gnawed at him. He knew what they meant without them saying it outright. Bethany was different, bold, unapologetic, and unashamed of who she was. In a town like Maplewood that made her a target for narrow-minded opinions. As the morning rush died down, the doorbell jingled, and there she was, her vibrant green dress standing out against the muted tones of the cafe. Her smile lit up the room, but Edward noticed the subtle glances and whispers that followed her. Bethany ignored them, walking straight to the counter. "Morning, Edward," she greeted cheerfully. "Morning," he replied, forcing a smile. "The usual? You know it." As Edward prepared her latte and slice of peach cobbler, he couldn't shake the gnawing unease in his chest. When he brought her order to the table, Bethany noticed his troubled expression. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Edward hesitated. "Yeah, just, people can be nosy around here." Bethany glanced around, her gaze sweeping over the other patrons. She knew exactly what he meant. The subtle glances, the not-so-subtle whispers. It was nothing new to her. "Let me guess," she said with a wry smile. "They're not thrilled about me hanging around their precious cafe." Edward sighed. "It's not you. It's them. This town doesn't handle different very well." Bethany's smile didn't waver. "Edward, I've dealt with this kind of thing my whole life. People will always have opinions, but their opinions don't pay my bills or shape my happiness." Her words were like a balm to his frayed nerves. "How do you stay so strong?" he asked quietly. Bethany leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Because I know who I am, and I know what I'm worth. The day you stop letting other people's opinions control you is the day you start living for real." Edward let her words sink in. He envied her confidence, her ability to brush off the small-mindedness of others. He wanted that kind of strength, but years of living in Maplewood had taught him to conform, to avoid making waves. "You're something else," he said, a hint of awe in his voice. Bethany's grin widened. "Takes one to know one." As they chatted, the tension in Edward's chest began to ease. Bethany had a way of making everything seem possible, even in a town that tried to crush dreams before they could take flight. A town divided. But Maplewood wasn't done talking. Later that afternoon, Edward made his way to the hardware store to pick up supplies for the cafe. As he browsed the aisles, he overheard two men talking near the paint section. "Foster's got himself a fancy new friend," one of them said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah," the other replied. "Don't know what he's thinking. She's not exactly Maplewood material." Edward clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the can of paint in his hand. He wanted to say something, to defend Bethany and himself, but the weight of years spent avoiding confrontation held him back. Instead, he paid for his supplies and left, his mind racing. The whispers were getting louder, and Edward knew that if he didn't stand up for what he wanted, the town's judgment would consume them both. A night of revelations. That evening, Bethany invited Edward to dinner at her temporary rental on the outskirts of town. The house was modest but cozy, filled with the mouth-watering aroma of freshly baked bread and spiced chicken. "You didn't have to go all out," Edward said as he took a seat at the small kitchen table. "I love cooking," Bethany said with a shrug. "Besides, you deserve a good meal after putting up with this town's nonsense." Edward chuckled, though the weight of the day still lingered. "You noticed, huh?" Bethany set a plate in front of him, her expression serious. "Edward, you've got to stop letting these people get in your head. They don't define you, or us." He met her gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes unmistakable. "It's hard. I've lived here my whole life. I guess I've just always cared too much about what people think." Bethany reached across the table, taking his hand. "Then it's time to stop. Life's too short to live for other people." Her touch was grounding, and Edward felt something shift inside him, a resolve he hadn't known he was capable of. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't want to hide anymore." Bethany's smile returned, warm and reassuring. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." As they ate, laughter and conversation filled the room, drowning out the whispers of Maplewood. For the first time in a long time, Edward felt free. Free to be himself, free to dream, and free to love without fear. But change was never easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges neither of them could anticipate. Bethany's arrival had already set something in motion, and Maplewood was about to learn that love, resilience, and courage could defy even the deepest-rooted prejudices. Standing tall, the summer sun was relentless, baking the sidewalks of Maplewood until they shimmered with heat. The town square bustled with activity. Children chased each other around the fountain. Shopkeepers chatted with loyal customers, and the scent of freshly grilled burgers wafted from the corner diner. But beneath the surface, there was tension, a palpable shift that had begun the moment Bethany arrived in town. Edward felt it everywhere he went. The pointed stares, the hushed whispers, the condescending smiles from people who thought they knew what was best for him. And it wasn't just about Bethany's presence, it was about the fact that he had chosen her. But today, Edward was done caring. Bethany had given him the courage to break free from the chains of other people's expectations. She had shown him what it meant to live authentically, unapologetically. And now, it was his turn to show the town that love didn't need anyone's approval. A turning point at the market. The weekly farmers' market was a Maplewood tradition, a gathering place where locals sold everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts. Bethany had set up a booth for the first time, showcasing her baked goods with a display as vibrant and inviting as her personality. Rows of golden brown croissants, glistening fruit tarts, and fluffy cinnamon rolls tempted passersby. The sign above the booth read, "Bethany's Blissful Bakes, where love meets flavor." Edward stood by her side, helping arrange the pastries while Bethany greeted customers with her trademark warmth. "You sure you're ready for this?" Bethany asked, a teasing glint in her eyes. Edward grinned. "I'm not hiding anymore, remember?" She squeezed his hand. That's the spirit. But not everyone was welcoming. Mrs. Whittaker strolled by, her lips pursed so tightly they could have sealed an envelope. Her eyes flicked over Bethany's display, and then to Edward. "Well," she said with thinly veiled disdain, "this is unexpected." Bethany's smile didn't falter. "Good morning, Mrs. Whittaker. Care to try a cinnamon roll? I guarantee it'll brighten your day." Mrs. Whittaker sniffed. "I'm sure they're lovely, but I'm set in my ways." Edward couldn't hold back. "Maybe it's time to try something new, Mrs. Whittaker. You might surprise yourself." The older woman's eyes widened in shock, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. She huffed and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Bethany laughed softly. "Bold move, Edward." "I'm just getting started," he said, his voice firm. A gesture of support. Not everyone shared Mrs. Whittaker's narrow-mindedness. As the morning wore on, more customers approached the booth, curious about the new baker in town. Some were hesitant at first, but once they tasted Bethany's creations, their skepticism melted away like butter on a warm biscuit. "This is amazing," one woman said, biting into a peach tart. "Where did you learn to bake like this?" "My grandmother," Bethany said proudly. "She taught me everything I know." "Well, you've got a customer for life," the woman declared, buying a dozen pastries. Edward watched with pride as Bethany won over hearts and taste buds. Her resilience was contagious, and he felt his own confidence growing by the minute. Then something unexpected happened. Tom Granger, one of the town's most respected businessmen, approached the booth. His imposing figure and stern demeanor usually intimidated people, but today he wore a thoughtful expression. "I've been hearing about your baked goods," Tom said, his voice gruff. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss is about." Bethany handed him a cinnamon roll. "Be honest with me, Mr. Granger. I can take it." He took a bite, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Tom chuckled. "Well, I'll be," he said. "This is the best thing I've had in years. You've got talent, young lady." "Thank you," Bethany said sincerely. Tom nodded to Edward. "You've got a good woman here, Foster. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Edward's throat tightened. "I won't, sir." As Tom walked away, other customers followed his lead, drawn by his unexpected endorsement. The booth grew busier, laughter and conversation filling the air. Bethany's success was undeniable, and Edward knew that this was just the beginning. An evening of reflection. Later that evening, Edward and Bethany sat on the porch of her rental house, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. The market had been a triumph, a turning point that proved they could thrive despite the town's skepticism. "You were amazing today," Edward said, his voice filled with admiration. Bethany smiled, her eyes shimmering in the fading light. "So were you." Standing up to Mrs. Whittaker. Bold move. Edward chuckled. She had it coming. Bethany's expression grew serious. "You know this isn't the end, right? There will still be people who judge us, who think we don't belong together." "I know," Edward said firmly, "but I don't care anymore. I love you, Bethany, and I'm done hiding that." Her breath caught, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with her. "I love you too, Edward," she whispered. The weight of their journey lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom. They had faced the judgment of a small town and come out stronger, their love unshaken. As they sat together, hand in hand, Edward knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, but they would face them together, with courage, resilience, and a love that defied expectations. Rising above the noise, Maplewood was changing, though not without resistance. Bethany's booth at the farmer's market had become the talk of the town, not just for her delicious baked goods, but for what she represented. Defiance against a culture rooted in sameness. Her success sent ripples through the close-knit community, stirring admiration in some and resentment in others. Edward stood by her side through it all, their bond growing stronger with each challenge. He had learned to silence the voices that once dictated his every move, finding joy in living authentically with the woman he loved. But as with any story of transformation, not everyone was ready to embrace the change. The anonymous threat. It started with a letter. Edward found it one morning tucked under the cafe's front door. The envelope was plain, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. Inside, a single sheet of paper carried a message that chilled him to the bone. "People like her don't belong here, and neither do you if you keep this up." His hands trembled as he read the words again, disbelief mingling with anger. Maplewood was supposed to be better than this, or at least he had hoped it could be. Bethany entered the cafe moments later, her smile fading as she sought his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etching her features. Wordlessly, Edward handed her the letter. She read it, her jaw tightening. "Well," she said after a tense silence, "looks like we struck a nerve." "You're not scared?" he asked, his voice low. Bethany met his gaze, unflinching. "I've faced worse. Fear only wins if you let it." Edward admired her strength, but he couldn't shake the protective instinct surging within him. "I won't let anyone hurt you, Bethany. I swear it." "I know," she said softly, "but we're not backing down. Not now, not ever." The town hall meeting. The letter was just the beginning. Rumors spread that a group of townspeople was petitioning to restrict outside vendors from participating in the farmer's market, a thinly veiled attempt to target Bethany. When Edward heard about the petition, he knew they had to take a stand. The town hall meeting was packed, tension thick in the air. Mayor Collins, a stout man with a booming voice, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss concerns raised about the farmer's market," the mayor announced. "I'll open the floor to comments." Mrs. Whittaker was the first to speak, her voice sharp. "Maplewood has traditions, and we need to protect them. Allowing just anyone to set up shop undermines our community values." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Edward's heart pounded, but he stood up, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "With all due respect, Mrs. Whittaker, tradition isn't an excuse for exclusion. Bethany's baked goods have brought people together. Isn't that what community is supposed to be about?" Bethany rose beside him, her presence commanding attention. "I came here to share my passion for baking, not to cause trouble. But if standing up for myself makes me a problem, then so be it. I'm not going anywhere." Silence hung heavy in the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, Tom Granger stood up. "She's right," Tom said gruffly. "Bethany's pastries are the best thing that's happened to this town in years. And Edward's Cafe. It's a damn good place to grab a coffee. We should be proud to have people who care enough to make Maplewood better." More voices joined in, support building like a wave. The tide was turning, and Edward felt a swell of hope. A victory of the heart. The town hall decision was clear. Bethany would stay. The petition was dismissed, and Maplewood took its first real step toward embracing change. As they left the meeting, Bethany squeezed Edward's hand. "We did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it together," he replied. That night, they celebrated with friends at the cafe, laughter and music filling the space. The walls that had once confined Edward now felt like a canvas for endless possibilities. Bethany's resilience had ignited a spark not just in him, but in the town itself. They had faced prejudice and fear, but love and courage had prevailed. A bright future ahead. Weeks turned into months, and Bethany's business flourished. She and Edward became partners in every sense of the word, their love story inspiring others to break free from the constraints of small-town expectations. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on the porch of their newly purchased home, Bethany rested her head on Edward's shoulder. "Do you think Maplewood's finally ready for change?" she asked. "I think we already changed it," he said with a smile. Bethany's laughter was warm and infectious. "Here's to breaking all the rules. And baking all the pastries," Edward added with a grin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and pink, they knew that their journey was far from over. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with love, resilience, and a determination to rise above the noise. Love, legacy, and new beginnings. The crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of apples and fallen leaves through Maplewood. Golden sunlight danced across the town square, where families gathered for the annual fall festival. Children's laughter filled the air as they raced between booths adorned with pumpkins and bales of hay. At the heart of the festivities, Bethany and Edward's joint booth was a hive of activity. A hand-painted sign read, "Blissful Bakes and Foster Cafe, a taste of home." The display was a testament to their journey. Rows of pastries glistening with sugar, buttery croissants stacked high, and steaming cups of freshly brewed coffee served with a smile. It was a sight that spoke of hard work, resilience, and love. Bethany stood behind the counter, her face glowing with happiness. "Cinnamon roll or apple tart?" she asked a young boy who gazed wide-eyed at the selection. "Both," he declared, earning a chuckle from his parents. As Bethany wrapped up the treats, Edward handed the parents their coffee. "Best decision you'll make today," he said with a grin. The family walked away happy, and the line continued to grow. A gesture of gratitude. Tom Granger approached the booth, his familiar gruff demeanor softened by a smile. "You've outdone yourselves again," he said, biting into a croissant. "High praise coming from you," Bethany teased. Tom nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen this town change a lot over the years, and I'll tell you what, you two have made it better. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Bethany's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Thank you, Tom. That means a lot." As he walked away, Edward wrapped an arm around her. "We did this, Bethany. Together." She smiled up at him. "And we're just getting started." A moment of reflection. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the festival, Bethany and Edward took a rare moment to sit on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. The hustle and bustle of the festival hummed around them, but they found peace in each other's presence. "Do you remember when we first met?" Edward asked, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Bethany laughed. "How could I forget? You were so nervous you knocked over my water glass. Hey, in my defense, you were intimidatingly beautiful." She arched an eyebrow. "Was? Still are," he corrected with a grin. They fell into comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling between them. There had been moments when it felt like the world was against them, but they had risen above it all. "Do you ever think about what people used to say?" Bethany asked quietly. Edward's expression hardened. "Sometimes, but then I remember that their opinions don't matter. What we've built together does." Bethany took his hand. "I wouldn't change a thing." "Neither would I." A community transformed. As the festival drew to a close, Mayor Collins took the stage to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for making this year's Fall Festival one of the best yet," he began. "Today, we celebrate not just our traditions, but our growth as a community." He gestured toward Bethany and Edward's booth. "I'd like to take a moment to recognize two individuals who have brought something truly special to Maplewood. Bethany and Edward, your dedication, talent, and love have inspired us all. Thank you for being a part of our town." Applause erupted, the sound washing over them like a wave. Bethany's throat tightened with emotion as she looked around at the smiling faces, some familiar, some new, all united in appreciation. Edward squeezed her hand. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Bethany said, her voice steady. "We are doing it." A vision for the future. As the crowd dispersed, a young girl approached the booth, her eyes wide with wonder. "Miss Bethany, how do you make your pastries so good?" Bethany crouched down to the girl's level. "It's all about love," she said with a wink. "You put love into what you do, and it shows." The girl's face lit up. "I want to bake like you someday." "You can," Bethany assured her. "And when you do, come find me. We'll bake together." As the girl skipped away, Edward watched with admiration. "You're changing lives, Bethany." "So are you," she said. They shared a smile, knowing that their journey was far from over. There were new dreams to chase, new challenges to face, and a future bright with possibility. Epilogue: Love that lasts. Years later, Maplewood would remember Edward and Bethany as pioneers of change, people who defied expectations and built a life filled with love and purpose. Their cafe and bakery became a beloved institution, a symbol of what could be achieved when fear was replaced with courage. But more than that, their story became a testament to the power of love, the kind that stands tall in the face of adversity, the kind that transforms lives, the kind that endures. As the last leaves of autumn fell, Bethany and Edward sat on their porch, watching the world they had helped shape, and in that quiet moment, they knew one thing for certain: their love was the greatest story of all.